This once a month depressing discussion of international affairs. This is the last session this spring, and we'll get going again in the fall. And for those of you who have a pencil, the first session will be September 10th, the second session October 8th, and the third one November 12th. September 10th, October 8th, November 12th. I will allow time to pass and see what's going on to determine exactly what I'm going to talk about. But definitely I will get back to sort of specific areas and policies rather than these broad things I've been talking about. Probably a session on conflict and war in various places, and a session on Africa. I'm going to go back to that, not just because I'm interested, but because all kinds of really important things with respect to Africa and the rest of the world are going on. But I might adjust it, and the third one I'll leave open to see what the events might be. I do want to talk about the topic of today, which is population, but let me preface it by saying, just listing the events since we last met, which are worthy of discussion, and certainly we can discuss them this morning. Golan Heights. International law says that territory claimed during warfare has to be returned when the war is over. So this is a violation of international law, to put it mildly. But it also sets just an incredibly difficult precedent, because everybody and their uncle, and especially the Russians, can say Crimea, really ours. All kinds of things in the Baltics. There are all kinds of areas that they can claim. So it also sends if the U.S. can do it, we can do it. So this is trouble down the road in many ways. The British mess and Brexit continues unabated. Turkey had an election that had an interesting outcome that has consequences. ISIS supposedly got defeated since we last met. Several thousand ISIS persons are running around the world. They may not have a territory, but they're equally dangerous running around the world. China decided to expand its Silk Road project all the way to Italy. That's interesting. India is about to have an election, largest democracy in the world. What's happening there is interesting. Afghanistan negotiations are ongoing, while at the same time Americans are getting killed. They finally have decided to include government representatives in the negotiation, which seems like a smart idea. Let's see, what else? It hasn't happened yet, but Europe will have its European Union will have its parliamentary election in May, and there are bound to be large increases, how large is unknown, of populists on the right and the left elected, and that might change and make things difficult in Europe, so watch out for that. And was it yesterday, the day before? The Trump administration said that the elite Iranian military are now an international terrorist organization. That promises to be fun down the line in the Middle East. And of course today is the Israeli election, which also promises to have interesting consequences. So even though I'm going to babble about population, all of these things are going on, and all of them are worth discussing. So why do I want to talk about population? Because population issues arguably will be one of the biggest issues in international politics in various places for the rest of the century. First, let me give you some, I know people hate it when I give them numbers and statistics, but let me give you a few to show you that, first of all, what most people have in mind, namely that the world population is growing like crazy and we're being swamped by all of this. That population growth in the world right now is a little over 1%. Okay, in the 1960s, it was 2%, which gives you a sense of how worldwide population growth, I'll tell you in a minute, keeps increasing for a variety of reasons, but the growth rate has radically slowed down. So that's actually for the globe and so forth. Good news. At the moment, demographers think there are about 7.7 billion people in the world, which is about half the number that demographers thought 10 years ago, when the idea was 14, 15, 16 billion people. The assumption is that the population that is in 2023, so that's what, 4 years from now, is going to be 8 billion, and that, population will obviously continue to increase. By 2088, it's assumed that the population might be 11 billion. But even at the end of this century, the number of people in the world may be very numerous, but the absolute numbers that people used to predict no longer seem to have a bearing, and that's really important. The other thing that's important to recognize about population is that at the moment, the median age of the population is, roughly speaking, 29.9% of young people. Okay. But that's about to radically change. And that radical change is already available if you look at other statistics, and I know playing around with statistics is not, a desirable thing, but right now is the first time in recorded world history that the number of people who are over 65 is greater than the number of people who are under 5. The number of people over 65 exceeds the number of people in the world who are under 5 years old. This is incredibly relevant for the domestic and international politics of the world, because what we have is a decline in population growth, right? But the decline is in part because there are fewer babies born. People are living longer, but fewer babies are born. And the consequence of it is that you have, in most countries, not all countries, but most countries, the aging of the population. So that within the next decade, it's already started in some countries, many countries won't have adequate labor force because people are aging out of the labor force. Okay? If people age out of the labor force, you either have a decline in the economy or you import labor. Because other countries, for a variety of reasons, the population might be younger, or their economy can't absorb the working age population, or any number of things. So, for the national politics of most countries, the problem of the aging population will increasingly become a problem. And not at the moment, we look at industrial countries and are saying, well, it's just the industrial countries, the European countries, they all will need foreign labor because they're aging out very badly. But it's not just that. It's so-called third world countries, like China, like India, like Thailand. They're all, within a decade or two, becoming very old and having fewer and fewer children, right? So that the aging problem is not just, at the moment it looks like an industrial country problem, but increasingly it will be a problem in countries that we think of as late industrializing. China, I've mentioned before, but let me just repeat, China is an interesting case because, of course, China had a one-child policy, right? So they, in a sense, through a policy which they now have reasons to be semi-sorry about, made sure that their population didn't grow, right? But they too, in China, people live longer and longer, right, on the one hand, so it's an increasing aging population. And number two, when the Chinese, a couple of years ago, was it, said, well, the one-child policy is dead, now go ahead and have more children, the Chinese decided not to have more children. That is to say, the policy change of now you can have more children hasn't produced more children. Why? Because, like any other society, middle-class society, modern society, parents are telling themselves, I can kind of educate and support one child and have my parents sort of raise the child while my husband and I go to work, or send them out to the countryside to have my parents raise them, which happens a lot in China. But in any event, we don't want a second and a third child. So even a country which had a rigid one-child policy and thought it could return to multiple children, it has not produced that. Sure, a few people have more than one child, but it hasn't changed the demographic perspective, which means China also will be aging, right? And not having a supply of younger people. Now, economists aren't sure what the consequences of all of this will be. That is to say, will it mean economies will decline because they can't be as productive? Or will it mean that people have to move around to wherever the jobs are in the world, where there is underemployment in a country? Underemployment may not just be a question of too many people, it may be not enough productive work to employ those people, right? So, what to do about this? Well, one of the things to do, of course, is to say we need people from the outside. We need, for example, if you need caretakers in Japan, there are Japanese who are volunteering to be caretakers. They can get better jobs. Where do we get them from? We get them from the Philippines. Oops, we're a homogeneous society. We don't want these people from the Philippines. And we certainly don't want those people to have children here who want to stay. So this is not a good thing. And the immigration mess that has been created in Europe, which was not for workers in the first instance, recently anyway, but rather had to do with war in Syria and all the rest, right, shows what chaos it creates when people from a different culture and a different religion move into your society, which used to be homogeneous, and you really don't like those people. I mean, even the very generous Swedes, who per capita admitted in more refugees than anybody else, has essentially isolated those people and is not integrating them really very well into Swedish society. Because Swedes say, well, we're Swedes and they're whatever, Syrians, Somalis or whatever, and they can live here, we will support them, but they're certainly not Swedish. Right? But the next generation is born in Sweden, and they know very little about their home country, and they say, well, we live here in Sweden, we want to be Swedish, we're not going back to Somalia, we know nothing about Somalia, other than that our parents talk about it, and the fact that people discriminate against us because we look like Somalis. Right? So the political problem in the domestic politics of countries, of having a demographic situation where people en masse will have to move out of their own societies into other societies who need them, who want them, is huge. And the fallout from that we can see right now, which is right-wing populism, left-wing populism, discrimination. We can see countries like Hungary say, Orbán says, Hungary is a Christian nation, and we're not going to allow anybody in here who's not Christian, right? And there are other countries, Austria, all kinds of countries, who are saying the same thing. So people are inclined to want to close their borders and stay homogeneous at a very time that the world population and the desirability of people to move where life is viable, where jobs are needed, are clashing. It's a huge problem, and it's an increasing problem, and it will get worse every year that we move along. So that's the first layer, which is just demographic. The second layer, having to do with population, has to do with climate change, which I talked about last time. Because in many countries, the climate has now changed sufficiently that people can no longer make a living where they lived. Let me give you an example close to home because it's a Trump thing. In Central America, many farmers are going out of business. The reason they're going out of business is due to climate change. Their little farms are no longer productive, either because there's not enough water or because pestilence has taken over the plants, like coffee plants, and they simply cannot make a living anymore. And they have no other options. So in societies where 60, 70, 80% of the population are farmers of one kind or another, these people are now anxious to leave, to become refugees somewhere, right? So the mess in Central America that we think about and read about these days has, yes, gangs, yes, drugs, yes, lots of things. But a lot of the families that are moving out not just because of that, but moving out because the husbands and wives can no longer produce enough to feed the family. So climate change, as well as demographic changes, are producing the desirability of people to move somewhere else. So there's not enough water. There's pestilence that is growing like mad. In addition, there is not just not enough water to farm, but for example in the Middle East, not enough water to sustain people. Right? Now, that is to say, people have to move because it simply is not enough drinking water. Do most of you have an idea of how little drinking water there is? I'm moving out of the Middle East. In India right now, in most parts of India, you get a gallon of water for multiple people. That's all there is, to drink, to wash, to whatever. And then people dig wells, deep wells, and try to find some water. And that water is badly polluted. It has lead in it and all kinds of things. So children have yes, thank you. And die and are, brain damaged and physically damaged and so forth. The water issues in a lot of parts of the world are horrendous. Now, it's also, while I'm talking about India, a horrendous problem in China, because much of China is a desert, right? Now, the Chinese happen to have the resources to build, huge dams and to do this and the other thing, but many countries don't. And even Chinese government is quite freaked out right now about the idea of what to do about the water situation for the population. Now, there are answers to the water situation, all kinds of answers. But one of the answers, of course, is to recycle all water, all sewage water and so forth. And I've talked about that before. There are now various ways of doing that. They're still expensive. And one of the countries that's at the forefront of being able to recycle water is in fact Israel, who if Israel was on better terms with other countries, could help them, people could emulate it, because there are relatively affordable recycling of water, and you have to be able, A, to do that, and B, there is of course the business of making salt water viable, and Israel again is at the forefront of being able to do that. right? So there are technological fixes, but they have to come relatively quickly within the decade. And even now, the dislocation of people in countries based on not just demographics and aging, but also having to do with climate and water is actually a very major problem facing the world and facing the population. What else to say about population? One of the ways that people in countries try to remedy their rural situation is to move into urban areas. And we are having larger and larger cities all over the world. Cities of 25 million moving to 40 million. It is remarkable and completely unimaginable even 10 or 20 years ago that you would have such huge cities. Why do people move into cities? Well, they move into cities because of the reasons I mentioned. You have rural unemployment, right? And you have climate change of various kinds making life in the rural area unviable. And going back to last time, you have technological changes which lead people to believe that if anybody is ambitious, that the good life is in urban areas. That leads to overpopulated urban areas. What's overpopulation? Overpopulation is an urban area which cannot manage housing, water, transportation for its population. It's not how many people live on an acre, because you can look at a country like Holland, which has incredible population density, but has it manageable in terms of all the resources, right? So it's not just that you can manage a large urban population, it's the fact that you have to have the money in the infrastructure and you have to change the lifestyle of people. People can't have their own houses anymore, they have to live in apartments. Their water has to be recycled in the apartment. And eventually you have to find employment for people. And so that leads actually to a very relatively confusing picture. In some countries, you say, well, a lot of the urban population are in fact fairly young people, which is true. If you look at New Delhi or Lagos, Nigeria, and so forth, the population is actually quite young in urban areas because those are the folks that decide to move into something and try something different and be part of the excitement of living in an urban area. So isn't that a contradiction? Well, no, it's not a contradiction, because the old folks left behind in the rural areas are still there because they don't think they have options, but eventually begin to start trickling into the urban areas as well as trying to emigrate to somewhere where they can either find land or live in urban areas. So you have sort of like multiple things happening simultaneously that they sound contradictory, but the bottom line is that in all the cases, people are on the move. People are living in a more and more concentrated situation. Concentration means you have to supply electricity, you have to supply water, you have to supply jobs, you have to supply sewage systems, you have to do all of those kinds of things. And of course, many countries are too poor to do that. Now, that of course sort of says the third world has problems. But, look at a place like New York City. It has a sewage system that's, 150 years old, and they think it's going to break down any day, and there'll be a monumental mess. Their subway and transportation system is in a monumental mess. So we're talking about, the most affluent society in the world trying to service and do proactive things in its urban areas, and it's not being done. So walking around condemning New Delhi and Nigeria strikes those folks over there as a bit rich, considering that they read about us and they think, well, why are those guys not doing it? Now, there are countries that are trying in one way or another to address the population shift. Now, let me remind you, I'm not just talking about the population aging, I'm talking about people physically shifting from one part of the country to the next, okay? For example, Mexico City is trying very hard to have an urban transportation system and is trying to build one to get cars off the road and all the rest. Certainly in China, fast trains everywhere, transportation. China building one airport after another. I think Beijing now has 5 and the 6th one is about to open. So it's not that people are not trying to address the issues. The question for politics is, are they addressing them quickly enough? That is to say, those countries that can afford to. But what about, African countries? What about Central American countries? Well, they have no resources to address these questions by and large. It's not just a question of a little corruption or not being able to shift things around. They simply don't have the resources, which makes it particularly odd, not really odd, that in trying to respond to the refugee crisis at our border, what Trump is doing is cutting the economic support for those countries. Because the likelihood of people staying put is enhanced if life in those countries is viable. And all the aid projects and so forth, trying to build schools, build roads, build infrastructure in Central America, is currently, the idea is to cut it, because those are bad people, they're, rapists and whatnot. So it's, in a sense, counter to all of that. And so when the U.S.'s foreign assistance programs, the World Bank, the UN, and so forth, has an ever-increasing shortage of funds. What it really means is not just that they keep supporting wasteful projects, and we all know that aid hasn't worked very well in the last 50 years, but it also means that at a crucial time right now, when those countries stand between keeping their citizens put and having their citizens go somewhere else, is when we're cutting the possibilities of governments to do something about any of this. Not a good idea. So, you got people moving into urban areas. You've got people moving into societies that needs their labor, right? And wants their labor. And you have political objections everywhere. They speak different languages, they don't look like us, blah, blah. Now, funny enough, of course, the United States is the country that has managed this best. That is to say, we've always managed to integrate the next wave of people. Having gone to high school in New York City in the 1950s, the problem then was Italians and Irish. The Italians didn't like the Irish didn't like the Italians, and the rest of the people didn't like either. So you had, find political ways to overcome this issue. So that by and large in New York City, not in every borough, but by and large, the fire department was Irish and the police department was Italian. And the city council had to have an Italian representative, an Irish representative, a Jewish representative, a Catholic representative. So you just had to have representative of everybody. And they managed, okay. Looking back at that, that seems an insane problem, because now we're worried about people who are Muslims and people of color and all kinds of things. No one talks anymore, really, seriously, about people of various European origin. That's gone away. We've somehow become integrated, all right? And furthermore, we in the United States take pride in that integration. It used to be, again, in the 50s and 60s, if you had some odd-sounding name, you change it to Smith and Jones and so forth, so people couldn't have your ethnic identity, right? Lots of people, many of you might have relatives who changed their name to make it, not just nowadays one says to make it easier to pronounce, but it really wasn't that. It was to sound waspish, so you could work at a bank and all those places that you were discriminated against. Nowadays, that all seems totally silly because people take pride in their origin, right? We're in a totally different we celebrate our origins, even if they're our grandparents' origins or whatever. We celebrate our ethnicity. We celebrate whether or not we're of some Asian origin or some black origin or whatever origin we might be. But we're all Americans, we say. So now, no matter how discriminatory our society has been to people of color over time, now we're saying, but that was different. What we really, really don't want is these people who speak Spanish, these people who wear headgear, these people who worship in fundamentally different ways. We could understand that there was Catholic, Protestant, Jewish splits, but God knows we certainly don't want these Muslims. And so even though our society used to be the role model for the rest of the world about how you can make it work, we are now at the forefront of saying, even in the US, this is not desirable. Okay? Which really means that we have very little international political leverage on anybody else. Okay? And at the same time, most countries in the world are multi-ethnic, multinational to begin with. There isn't a single African country other than arguably Ethiopia and Somalia which is not multi-ethnic. Or in the old days it used to be said multi-tribal. Okay. There are very few Balkan countries that were not multi-ethnic, although they've now split up and they're still negotiating that. Almost all of Latin America would be considered multi-ethnic if you acknowledge that people native to South America and Central America are in fact people who belong there. That is to say, the discrimination of people of Indian origin of any kind is very, very heavy and very, very bad. Many of you might have traveled in Mexico, and you might have noticed that lots of Mexican you meet, one of the first things they tell you is we're entirely of European origin. My ancestors were Italian or Spanish or something, lest you think there might be some Indian blood mixed into them, no matter how dark they are and how much they might look like people who are mixed with native population. And the other thing you might notice is that the elite certainly in Mexico and much of Latin America is very white and very European origin, as distinct from the rest of the population. Right? So the illusion that those are homogeneous countries that don't have discrimination is just an illusion. A massive country like India is very multilingual, very multi-ethnic. Okay? And one of the ways that they proceeded when they became independent is to say you can have your own language and your own religion, but everybody here speaks English, which is actually an interesting thing worth thinking about. Because several African countries and India decided that the only way to knit this country together was to have an umbrella language that everybody who had even a semblance of education had, and underneath that you could practice your own language, right? Nigeria had that for a while. Kenya had that for a while. There are other countries who tried to deal with their multi-ethnic situations. But the examples I just gave are all historical examples, hundreds of years, decades of evolution. What's happening now is that new people are arriving for all the reasons I've already talked about. And these new people are largely considered a threat to the culture. Right? So the French skirt around the fact that they don't really think the North Africans whose colonizers they were are really, really French. Although educated elite French will tell you, we don't care as long as they speak beautiful French. that the variable is to speak beautiful French. So when, for example, just to give you an example, when the first president of Senegal, a West African French colony, Leopold Senghor, became president after independence. He was a member of the French Assembly. He had gone to the Sorbonne. He wrote poetry in French. And when you said to somebody in France, well, you actually discriminate against these Africans, and saying, we don't discriminate against Senghor. He's like us. Right? He too has the best education, speaks beautiful French, and so on. So the elite will tell you that. The people who are not elite in France don't even pretend that that's the case. These guys are, from Algeria or Morocco or West Africa or wherever, and we really don't particularly want them. Okay. England, just to go around the world a bit, had a separate issue, which was that they constantly had back and forth between their colonies and England. People in the colonies like India went to Oxford and Cambridge and this and that and the other thing, but they really played no role in the governance of Great Britain. Dare I say it? Is Irene here? I get chastised on that all the time. Of Great Britain. Then there was the problem of the people from the Caribbean who were, of course, of African origin, slaves brought to the Caribbean. And so they could move in one fashion or another. And that was by and large in the 50s and 60s, not necessarily desirable, but it's okay because you needed them for labor of one kind or another. So that was more or less okay. Then, of course, all of these people started having children and not having any links to anybody and considered themselves English. Then you got the second wave when Idi Amin, you remember him, dictator of Uganda, shucked all the people of Indian origin out of Uganda, and eventually, more or less, Kenya did the same thing. And you had armies of people arriving in England who were from the colonies, but they were no longer colonies, they were now independent countries, and who the hell needs so many of them? Okay? So there was a kind of right-wing, Trump-like, not quite like Trump, figure called Enoch Powell, and he got Parliament to do something, which is take away the dual citizenship of all people in the colonies. Because up until now, if you lived in a British colony, you had a citizenship in whatever country you were in, and automatically you had English citizenship, so you could move around and live either. So when this whole group of Indians were chucked out of Africa, England all of a sudden said, no, you don't have English citizenship anymore. And that created a big problem in English politics that I won't bore you with. But I'm saying all of this not to bore you with details so much as to say there have been different histories and different ways that people have dealt with groups of people coming in. And when groups of people came in from the colonies, whether desirable or undesirable, people, even middle-class people, would say, well, they're at least like us. For example, they drink tea, in the case of England. And when people in the European Union who can move around freely, which is a separate issue, started going to England after the wall came down, Poles en masse and Bulgarians and Romanians and whatnot came to England in large numbers. The English really seriously hated it and discriminated against them and said, when you said, well, but there were people from the Caribbean and people from India and Pakistan, and people would seriously say to you, including well-educated people, at least they drank tea, which was a symbol of they had imbibed our culture in the colonies. But these Poles are just ridiculous. So you now have a situation in England where if England, I don't want to get deeply into Brexit, gets out of the EU, for example, all these people can't be moving around anymore, right? Members of the Union. And the English will be delighted because they got sick and tired of people speaking Polish, people speaking all those East European languages. But here's the problem, and it's a serious problem. And that is the reason people moved to England was because England had a dearth in competent blue-collar workers. They didn't have electricians and plumbers and so forth. Nor did they have, at the lower level, people to pick their fruits and vegetables, also our problem. So these people were, in a sense, for the economy, a gift, because they had the very skill that the economy needed, but people hated it. And here I want to illustrate something, and that is, it's not enough for people or a society or a country or a culture to need people. It's the fact that the politics of it very often are different than the economics. You might have the need in the United States for workers in nursing homes, but independently you will tell a friend on the street, we really don't want all these Spanish-speaking people here, right? They're separate issues. Right? The politics of it is one issue. The economics is another issue. And when a government comes along and says, whether it's Japan or India or the UK or the United States, comes along and says, we're being overrun by these people, right? That's a political statement. It's not an economic analysis. Because if you look at, again, I don't want to dwell on the U.S. If you look at the U.S. right now, it is badly in need of the very workers that are coming across the border, in nursing homes, in fast food chains, on farms, all kinds of things, right? And those, if you talk to farmers in the Central Valley, they can't find enough workers. They would love these people to be coming over, right? But if you talk to a citizen in the area, in Monterey or in Santa Cruz or something, they say, well, you know, they're really ruining our community, and one of the telltale signs of ruining your community, or some of them, are one, people speak a different language, B, they look different, C, they have different religious practices, right? All of which means that their culture is somewhat different. So then the prejudices start. And the prejudices are that these Irish and these Italians, we now look back, integrated in society. And the few colonials who showed up in Europe and so forth integrated in society. That was okay. But these new people are not integrating. These new people keep speaking their languages and keep practicing their religion. By the way, I've mentioned this before, there is no empirical evidence for that. That is to say, Spanish speakers who arrive in the United States, the next generation has learned English as quickly as our ancestors and whatever learned it. So there are empirical studies, including from people at the Heritage Association and right-wing people, who show that it simply is not true. What makes us feel they never learned English down there in Watsonville is because there's constant new arrivals, which means people are always speaking Spanish. The people that wind up at Cabrillo and UC who are their children, chances are move out. Right? But there's a constant new supply, so it feels like these people never stop speaking Spanish. Okay? In more homogeneous societies to begin with, like let's say China, like let's say Japan, like let's say Korea, you have a different dynamic. And the first thing to be said is that in Korea and Japan, you do have rather homogeneous societies. This is not actually true in China, because China has the same virtue that the countries that decided to have a single language on top of local languages decided to have. And the big boon for the Chinese is that they speak many languages that are versions of Chinese that are incomprehensible to other people. But they have a single written language that everybody can understand, right? And the Chinese, in their wisdom, decided that that might not be enough as new people come in. What you need, in addition to a written single language, is to make everybody also be able to speak Mandarin, which is the dominant language of the government. So if you meet young Chinese, they can speak whatever plus Mandarin. If you meet middle-aged or old Chinese, they might have a little knowledge of Mandarin, but not too much. So again, a conscious choice to deal with population diversity of one kind or another. Now, I'm not putting China forward as an ideal role model here, because of course you've all read about the Uyghurs up there in the West, and they're like in concentration camps and all the rest. But if truth be told, one of the things the Uyghurs are not is Han Chinese. In fact, if you travel in that part of China, which, thanks to my husband, I have, a lot of them look like more or less the way the rest of us look. That is to say, you know, brown hair, sometimes blue or green eyes, and so forth. Because the Uyghurs are actually not Han Chinese. They were part of the empire building of China, and they are Turkic people, and their language is Turkish derivative. Right? It also happens to be that they're Muslims, which is a separate issue. But it's also not the case that China is quite as homogeneous as they sometimes look. But there are homogeneous countries. So here we have a need for population movement. Here we have ongoing population growth. Here we have a situation where, one, resources of land and water and air and whatever is not in short supply. Here you have a situation where the demographic changes inside countries, namely age groups and so forth, has changed, all of which mean people either should be allowed to move or in due course have to move into societies for them to be functioning. It is very easy for the Italians, which some of you spent good deal of time in Italy, but for the Italians to have said, was it 10 years ago, that you can't possibly have a Miss Italy who's not Italian, right? So there was a Miss Italy who was some kind of mixed race origin, very beautiful woman. She became Miss World or whatever, represented Italy, and the Italians had a fit because she was not Italian. Well, there are people who say, this family that's come from Korea or Philippines and Japan, whatever they are, they're not Japanese. It's the Swedes, even liberal Swedes, who say whatever these Ethiopians or the Somalis or Eritreans are, they're not Swedish. Okay. Is there a way to resolve it? Sure. A, tolerance, and B, intermarriage, of which some goes on, but probably not fast enough for the politics of it. And the politics of it are not only that you increasingly have right-wing politics inside of countries because of this, as well as often racist left-wing politics, populists on both sides. But what you also have, which people will rue historically and people write about it, is that the lead country in the world, the United States, which has demonstrated it can integrate people, it welcomes people, even though everybody in the world knows we've been a racist society since we started, but nevertheless has made an attempt and at least preaches that you can have a heterogeneous society and a democratic society, is the country now that argues against it. It not only argues against it for itself, but it's very sympathetic for those overseas who also argue against it. And that, I think, historically will be considered a tragedy, because what it means is it will not stop the demographic changes to take place, but the consequences of these demographic changes in combination with the climate changes will create a situation which can only lead to conflict and has absolutely no way of being resolved internationally or nationally. Now, obviously, you can say, well, I'm being too pessimistic because I'm always giving you bad news, but there are things like international law and international institutions and so forth which try to push against that. Okay? But international law and international institutions only make sense if they're adhered to. And there again, the U.S. used to be at the forefront for arguing in favor of international law. But now we say, the hell with asylum law. We don't have to listen to it. We'll just override it. The hell with humanitarian rules, international humanitarian. There's a treaty on the rights of children, which, among many other things, would not allow for the separation of children from their parents, and so on down the line. So there again, what's so sad is that the country which could say, all right, we can affect climate, but climate and demography are sort of two patterns which are moving along, and you can try to tinker with it and so forth. But fortunately, after the Second World War in particular, we developed institutions and rules which work against the worst harm that these phenomena will do. And at that very same time, the country in the lead of all of that is throwing up and saying, the hell with it, America first, we don't care, and we certainly don't care about international law. Who in hell told the United States it has to adhere to international law? We're just not adhering to it. Now, I'm painting worst case scenario here. I mean, you could imagine it getting better and so forth. One won't, in terms of the U.S. role, down the line. But you can't often put the genie back in the bottle. Because if you've done what we're doing, you can't then in 4 years or 8 years say to the rest of the world, well, we're going back to where we used to be on this, and now we want you to do X and Y. Because at that particular point, the populist rage in those countries will have grown to the extent that people in individual countries can't put the genie back in the bottle. Right? So I guess what I'm saying is not only is the trajectory bad, but the reversal of the trajectory is going to be very difficult, because once you unspool all of these rules and laws and institutions and ways of doing things, and U.S. leadership, hypocritical as some of our leadership has been, I know that, but still, you can't then all of a sudden say, now we've changed our mind. It would take a long time to produce that. So while you stew on that, let's have a break. Before I open up the floor, Michael Warren reminds me that when I said England didn't mind getting people from the Caribbean because they drank tea, that wasn't the only reason. It was also they played cricket. And that helped the cricket teams a lot. And as he points out, the Poles do not play cricket. So it's just an update. I was incomplete in my assertion there. Okay, so let me open it up to discussion of anything that had to do with population, but also all of these current issues that I raised are fair game. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Absolutely. So did you hear the question or the comment, which that Haitians went to the Dominican Republic? Some of them have actually lived there for years, and their children are born in the Dominican Republic. But the Dominicans are very clear that Haitians are different from them, and they don't want them, and they want to send them back. And that raises a not dissimilar question from the U.S. also sending Haitians back to Haiti, as well as Liberians, which is the latest. Now, in the case, I want to differentiate a little bit. In the case of the Haitians in the Dominican Republic, that's an old conflict, and it raises the question of, if you didn't give citizenship to people, are you in a position to chuck them out? Okay. In the case of us sending the Haitians and Liberians back, in both cases, those people got special visas and special permission to come to the U.S. as temporarily during the crisis in Haiti, based on the earthquake and all of that, and the civil war in Liberia. And Haitians and people of Haitian Liberian origin in the United States lobbied Congress and the U.S. government to allow people in because their situation at home was terrible, right? And we've always had a category for immigration that wasn't permanent immigration on your path to citizenship, but temporary immigration while a crisis was afoot in the country. And so the Trump administration has decided, it's not just it's slightly different, that the Haitians and the Liberians, in the case of the Liberians, they've been here, 20 years, something, are now going to be chucked back. And that was now, theoretically, he has the power to do that. In practice, he should be consulting, A, with Congress, and B, somebody should be mindful of the fact that all kinds of Haitians and Liberians were born in the United States, are now functioning semi-adults and adults, and sending them back to countries where they have no linkages whatsoever. That's especially true in the case of Liberians. They have no association with Liberia at all anymore. The parents did, but the children didn't. And they're just saying these people have to be shipped back. So that's now a big quarrel. Julie? No, not America. No, this category of people who were let in, they were not on a path to citizenship, but they were let in as an emergency category. Yes, which is, of course, some of them were not born here and they were infants, right? And the ones that were born here, you might have noticed that part of the immigration discussion right now is he wants to get rid of birth citizenship, and he thinks he can do that by executive fiat. Right? But that would, of course, I'm sure that'll go to court, right? So you have all kinds of, if you came here when you were 2 or 3 years old, you've gone through high school, college, whatnot, no one in your family still lives in Liberia, what the hell are you going to do when you go back to Liberia? A kind of similar thing happened to Cambodians, because Cambodians were also let into the U.S., some of them as refugees on their path to citizenship, but some to just as an emergency measure to get them out of their country, right? And their children very often grew up entirely in Los Angeles or wherever, outside of San Diego. I think there's a big Cambodian colony. And the reason we thought we could deport them, but that was already the Bush administration, was that a lot of these kids, even some of them who were born in the United States and therefore citizens, but many of them just came as infants, became gang members of one kind or another and had some kind of rap sheet. And as a consequence, we deported them. A nightmare for these people. They did not speak anything that anybody speaks in Cambodia. They had no relationships left in Cambodia. A lot of them have become street people in the capital, Phnom Penh. And, so you want to sort of say, where's the humanity in all of this, right? Let's say you get a traffic infraction, you don't have a license plate or a license or something. It's not even a serious crime. And I think we shipped within 2 months 6 plane loads of these Cambodians back to Cambodia, right? With no regard at all for them. And that, of course, has some kind of political support in the U.S. because, they're not Americans. What are they doing here? We don't like them. Their food smells funny. It's all of that kind of stuff, which leads the communities around them not to really object. And then, the ACLU and liberal organizations object. But if you are a conservative Republican congressman, you support the administration, right? We don't want this riffraff around. So, going back to your point, of course, is that it had to do with the Haitians and the Dominican. These people left Haiti because economics were inviolable, and they thought, if you look at the map, you can see how proximate those places are, and they thought, well, we have a better chance over here. And because they were Haitians and French-speaking, and the people in the Dominican Republic speak Spanish, and many of them kept speaking French, they were easy to isolate, even if not physically, in terms of what they spoke. Bad situation. Yes, ma'am. Deteriorating relationship with Puerto Rico is the question. You might have noticed that President Trump said the other day that we have been sending all this aid over there that they've wasted, and it's time to put the money into America. Yes. Happens to be part of America, but never mind. And lots of people buy that. That is to say, lots of people think Puerto Ricans are some kind of alien people, when in fact they're all American citizens and so forth. When you have a poor country like Puerto Rico, and 80% or whatever it was of its infrastructure get destroyed, it takes a lot to rebuild it. And furthermore, it shouldn't be rebuilt the way it got destroyed, because it was very outdated and rickety to begin with. You really should rebuild it in state-of-the-art electrical and so forth system. We shuffled some money towards Puerto Rico, not as much as we announced. There's lots of money still held up in Puerto Rico. And lo and behold, there are still places in Puerto Rico where people don't have running water or electricity, or where there are no functioning hospitals. And it would require a fairly long-term investment of a serious kind to help Puerto Rico become something resembling a modern society, like our various states, right? Even our backward states are in better shape than Puerto Rico. So that's the first issue. The second issue is, because things are so hopeless in Puerto Rico, if you're a young Puerto Rican, especially with some skills, and seeing the mess after the hurricane, you quickly take yourself to New York or somewhere where you can get a decent job, and where you are, have electricity and all the rest of it. So there was a big exodus out of Puerto Rico, which wasn't just a temporary exodus, but exodus of people who are saying, well, for the next decade or whatever, because people actually moved between the United States and Puerto Rico quite a bit to see relatives and stuff. So that Puerto Rico lost a lot of its functioning labor pool to restore Puerto Rico, and the U.S. government did not allow the Army Corps of Engineers and so forth to go in there and substitute and so forth. So as long as we consider Puerto Rico as this defective place out there, and we don't want to waste money, America first, and we don't consider it part of America, not surprising. And there is no assumption that anything will turn around very quickly. And as you have read and heard in the last few days, we get rid of all the Homeland Security people. There's no seriously functioning FEMA anymore. All these agencies have eroded. It also means that when we go in there, we have no real capacity to assist and help and so forth. So it's a nightmare. And if you were Puerto Rican and you could get out of there, you would get out of there at this point. Can't be blamed. I mean, Puerto Ricans are quite loyal to Puerto Rico, so at some point some might go back, but not right now. American democracy moved to an American empire, less of an empire, more of an authoritarian state. Empire means we conquer places out there. We're not conquering too many places. In fact, the idea is to move out of places where we have a commitment. So I don't know exactly what you have in mind there, but certainly authoritarian and certainly isolationist. So do you have something in mind in terms of empire building? Oh, well, telling the world what to do is not empire building. It's major country, in a sense, dictating to other countries what they should be doing without annexing them, right? I mean, the word empire is kind of technical. You assume that the country is taken over. But we're not taking over other countries. We're just telling others what to do. But actually the more startling thing, I think, you might disagree with that, is less than us bossing other countries around and more of us supporting leaders in countries which themselves aren't democratic, and which themselves are happy to coordinate and cooperate with the U.S. right? So more and more authoritarian leaders are out there for the reasons I mentioned, populism on the right and the left, and immigration and climate change and all those good things. So rather than us advocating for democracy and critiquing, even though we shouldn't be in the middle of other countries' politics, but critiquing the move to authoritarianism. Anybody looking at us right now and saying, look, the president says he can do anything through executive authority, and so can our leaders. So we're encouraging other authoritarians of one kind or another. Take the European Union and all of that. They're having a struggle not just with United Kingdom, yes, I got it right, with the United Kingdom, but they're having a struggle with outliers that are part of the European Union, like Hungary, right? Because for all practical purposes, Hungary should be chucked out of the EU, right? Because it's violated many of the basic tenets of the EU. They haven't done it yet because they don't want the EU to come unraveled. And they're hoping that the EU can make some pressure to these authoritarian leaning, or in the case of Hungary, I think you can actually say authoritarian governments. But that's just trying to push them, right, a little bit. As it's difficult for the EU to push these countries when the US and the American president goes to those countries and meets those leaders and congratulates them on all their virtues. That is to say, it's, President Trump is not going to Scandinavia and saying, look what, reasonably functioning social democracy you have. But he's going to, he meets the Polish leader and, Putin and so forth and so on, the Hungarian leader, and congratulates people and saying, you're one of ours, not just in Europe, internationally. And that, of course, encourages those people and makes it very difficult. There is, the world has, there's a fair criticism of the U.S., which is the world sort of became adjusted to the fact that you can pretty much kick back and let the Americans handle things. Politically, to some extent militarily and economically and so forth. And when the U.S. is not at the forefront of encouraging democracy and human rights and international law and so forth, it's very, very difficult for smaller countries to lead in any way. I mean, Angela Merkel tried, but she got done in over the immigration business. In the UK, you don't really have functioning governments. France is, for one reason or another, in a mess. Spain has separatist movement, and it's in a huge mess. Italy is right-wing and in a big mess. So who's out there? Right? And you would say, well, there are other big countries in the world. For example, Brazil. Brazil has a right-wing authoritarian leader that they elected, right? So there's no real leadership in the world. And the European Union is having a really hard time to exercise some kind of leadership in the absence of having gotten used to the U.S. Exercising leadership. And then there's Putin and Russia. I mean, let me just spend 2.5 minutes on that. I mean, Russia historically has had an ego of being taken seriously on the world stage. At every moment in Russian history, when it was no longer taken seriously, there were problems. Then you have communism coming into being, then it's the other major power in the world, the other atomic power, and so forth. And then the world got used to this bipolar. There's Russia, and they're mucking around in communist countries, and then there's U.S. in favor, I'm simplifying everything, in favor of democracy and so forth. So then comes the end of the Cold War. And what does the U.S. announce? We've won. Democracy has won, the U.S. has won, Russia is now a small economy, relatively speaking. Yes, it has some oil, and yes, it has weapons, but we now don't need to worry about them because they're just a small country now. It's now the U.S. century, right? We're there. This does not sit well with not just the government and not just Putin, but the Russian people. And it's still, the Russian people still more or less support Putin, because Putin, in a sense, is doing what Trump is doing, saying Russia first or US first and so forth. We want to get out here. So now we've got the problem of this former Soviet Union in various ways, rebuilding its armed forces, moving into Crimea, doing this, that, and the other thing, building new weapons, threatening the West, and so forth. But the psychological framework within which all of this is happening is not alien to many Russians, because they see, okay, we don't like Putin much, he's doing all kinds of bad things, but at least he's fighting for us, he's putting us back on the map, right? So now we are out of the post-Cold War phase into a very different phase of international politics. And from our perspective, so we get rid of an arms agreement, which allows us to rebuild new arms, and the Russians and so forth, and we can talk about that when we talk about arms control, but that's a mess. But the Russians are also saying, listen guys, we're back, which is why we sent 100 Russian military to Venezuela. Well, we say as Americans, have you heard of the Monroe Doctrine, which says this is in our backyard? And they say, yeah, we've heard of the Monroe Doctrine, but you're in our backyard everywhere. Yeah, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, is that a saying? That has created a entirely new dynamic. And the hope was, on the part of many people, that the European Union would find the strength and the energy to play a dominant role. And then comes Great Britain, and it's Brexit, and this and that and the other thing. So now you have an ex-major power getting back in the game. You have the former major power saying America first. You have Europe in disarray, and you have a lot of third world countries going, or former third world countries, going their own way, and in some senses actually doing remarkably well. There are countries in Latin America who are economically and politically doing rather well. There are even countries in Asia and Africa who are doing relatively well. So it's a mess. Where this mess will settle, we can debate. But at the moment, you have what historians will call a different world order than we had 10, 15 years ago. The gentleman considers corruption to be a main factor. And could I talk about corruption for a minute? It's hard to find a society that's not corrupt at the moment. The corruption is by degrees. Right? I mean, the Japanese might lock up a former auto executive. It doesn't mean the whole society is corrupt, but they're obviously corrupt people. Some societies are just riven with corruptness. There are some countries that have some corruption, and they're trying to fight against it. Right? And then there are some countries which have become increasingly more corrupt. Right? I mean, in the case of Brazil, it's been corrupt for a long time. Does one want to argue that because there's now a right-wing person dealing with corruption, it is worse than a left-wing person dealing in corruption? We can argue about that. But part, I think, of what has happened, and I'm thin ice here, is that you've always had corruption in most countries of varying kinds. Very often, the corruption wasn't really horrible in its consequence. It was kind of greasing the wheels. It was minor. It was tolerable. It didn't fundamentally change the nature of society. Then you began to have a phenomenon which did not exist historically, which is that a small percentage of people essentially own the world. Right? That's the difference now. It's not just some corrupt individuals here and there, or corrupt Chicago or whatever. It is the fact that you have this 1%. I think I was correct last time, when I said 85 humans in the world's acid are equivalent to half the world's populations. right? And people kind of notice that, and that destabilizes most societies, including the United States. That is to say, you get people on the right and people on the left who are, for one reason or another, anxious about this. And it's global. And because it's global, it means those who hold the assets can move them around, right? If some country gives you difficulty, you just move your assets to somewhere else. You will have noticed that at the small level, Mr. Trump moved his assets around to funny banks and this and that and the other thing, right? So even a small operator like Trump got the general idea that many of your corrupt activities best happen offshore, right? So the interdependence of the world right now, plus this discrepancy, is making itself felt almost everywhere. Now, how does it make itself felt? It makes itself felt on the one hand that you get extreme politics happening in a lot of countries, and cynicism, right? And that leads to extreme politics. It also means that a greater distribution of the wealth is almost very difficult because you can't catch these guys as they move their money around, right? And that leads people to feel that they live in a very unjust country and in a very unjust society, or in a very unjust world, and that has political consequences. Right? Now, is there anything that can be done about it? Probably. Anything to be done about it quickly? Probably not. You all are, I don't think there's anybody sitting here who is not a beneficiary of having stocks or pensions or something. Some of those investments are quite corrupt, or they feed into the corruption. So it's easy for us to sit around and think, well, we live in a nice town. Nowadays, many of us have $1 million houses, even if we didn't pay $1 million for it. But we're not really part of that. But in a fundamental way, most of us have at least a small corner of this. We don't know what to do about it. Do you want to put all your money under the pillow or under the mattress? Probably not. Do countries need stock markets and investments? Yes. Is the tax system basically unfair in many countries? Yes. The odd thing about taxing people who are, moving into the top 5% or 1% is that in the U.S. the idea has existed for a long time, is that if you overly tax the rich people, they won't invest. But if you have an income of millions and billions, you already have the fat house and the yacht and the so forth. You don't actually spend that money anymore. You have nothing to spend it on. You have everything you possibly imagine, and you still have billions left, right? So, in a sense, that's not the answer. On the other hand, that's not the problem. On the other hand, the answer, of course, is that you have some serious redistribution. And for, again, the sort of more democratic socialist countries in Scandinavia, people pay huge amounts of taxes. And by and large, some people object. By and large, people don't object. And the reason they don't object is because they see getting something for it. From, child care from birth, this, that, and the other thing. So they actually see some social benefits. And part of our way of looking at it is that first, you don't want to tax them, and second of all, if you certainly don't want it redistributed in any kind of, equitable kind of way. Now, what I'm saying is only partially true because, for example, rock stars and so forth, who are, let's say, Swedish or Icelandic or Norwegian, put their money, get citizenship in France or somewhere else, place where they're taxed less. But in any event, the whole tax business, crazy as it is, of taking more resources from the rich and distributing it, actually means that those to whom it's distributed have to feel they get some benefits out of it. And in many countries, including our own, all we feel is that there's corruption and people don't really get benefits, in which case we throw up our hands and become depressed, negative, whatever. Faye sees a disjunction between people having unfair distribution of resources, that historically there have always been rich people and poor people, but now with education you have this new disjuncture, right? And what I'm saying is, I think she's making a really good point, only I would substitute access to knowledge rather than education. Lots of people don't have access to very good education or no education or whatever, but everybody in the world, even in most of the poorest countries, are running around with cell phones and have access to almost everything. And that means people know what's going on. And people, therefore, feel more hostile when the discrepancy, and that's your point, the discrepancy between themselves and everybody else is huge. I mean, in ancient times when you, let's say, had royalty in Europe, people somehow knew that the royals were better off than they were, who were slaving on their farms. On the other hand, there weren't that many royals to begin with, so it was a small proportion. And second of all, the royals, you know, they had big houses, but they also didn't have running water before you had running water, and they also ate out of whatever tin cans because there weren't dishes at the time. So you see that they had opulent clothing and carriages and all the rest of it, but their lifestyle was not totally distinct from yours, right? But really, the main point I want to make off your question is access to information. That is to say, people in poor countries know that what goes on in the rest of the world, but they also have access to what's going on in their own country, both visually, that is to say, you can see it on your, and I think we underappreciate how deep and broad that access is. You know, I keep saying 85% of every Kenyan has a cell phone or access to one. In some countries, it's almost 100%. People just know what's going on, never mind whether education is good, bad, or indifferent. So the visibility of that. The other thing is politically, actually. The difference between affluence and poverty is not most of the time what mobilizes people politically. That is to say, for example, when you see people emigrating, going to other countries, they're usually not the poorest people in the society. They're the people who had some assets or thought there was a future and have now lost hope, right? There is a very, I want to say middle class, but not middle class by our reckoning. Then, generally speaking, people who make a revolution, Fanon was wrong on that, for those of you who read Fanon in school, people who make a revolution, who emigrate, who demonstrate, etc., are not the poorest, the worst off in society. They're people who've begun to see upward mobility for themselves, which they can't achieve. And that's actually very important, because when, for example, people argue against immigration to their countries, where, let's say, in Europe or the United States, they imagine it's these, you know, impoverished, illiterate Poles. But what it is, in fact, is working, middle-class, skilled Poles who temporarily moved to Europe because they could earn more money, right, and then move back later on, very often. And that's true worldwide. So we need to get it out of our mind that the discrepancy between the very rich and the very poor leads the poor to mobilize. You know, it doesn't, even in this country, migration from the south to the north was not necessarily the most illiterate, poorest people. It were people who imagined that they began to have some skill or some ambition, and therefore thought new vistas because they felt stuck in their own society. But what's really revolutionary is the access to information, right? And we really haven't fully digested what the implications of that are, politically or socially. let me start in a funny sort of way. Right-wing conspiracy people in the U.S. are putting out stuff on the internet which says that the empty shelves you see, the dysfunctioning hospitals, and the people leaving is all fake news. That there's plenty in Venezuela. We're just buying this, right? And that's true at the extremes on both sides. Well, so about 3.5 million people have left Venezuela in this mess. They've gone to Colombia and so forth. Mostly to Colombia, but also other countries. And again, these are not the poorest people in society. These are by and large people with a little assets, middle class or middle class aspirations who decide we don't want our children to perish, we can do this, we have the means, we can go to Colombia, yes, we will do that, but we have a few $100s or pesos or whatever. So that's there. The Maduro regime, as we know, is left-wing and communist. But we've got this thing about Cuba and Venezuela that has been persistent in the U.S. There are many undesirable things, especially pre the current administration in Venezuela, and currently, some of you have been to Cuba, yes? But, you know, they're functioning societies that have been badly screwed by the United States, and they soldier on, and in some ways Cuba is remarkable in its resilience. And Venezuelans were fairly remarkable in their resilience against their socialist government. But then corruption set in, the new head of state came who was totally incompetent, and things started unraveling. Things started unraveling because of the strategy and the politics inside of Venezuela. It did not, contrary to what's on the media sometimes, unravel because the United States lowered the price of petroleum. It is true that the largest amount of petroleum from Venezuela has always come to the U.S. And there's been a lot of corruption in terms of that, which is why that was kept up. So the Venezuelan situation is everybody's ball game now, right? It's the current government, the opposition, the Russians are there, the Americans are there, and no one, including me, knows how this is going to be resolved. The current administration might be able to hang in there. If Trump gets the bright idea to send U.S. military there, then we have a blow-up in terms of all of Latin America, because the history of U.S. intervening in Latin America is such that that is an absolute no-no, red line for the Latin Americans of one kind or another. So he's being advised by everybody from Latin America, from right-wing to left-wing, do not do this. But then, of course, there are the Russians there. And the Russians say, you know, what's wrong with us going there? You've every place. You're in 40 different countries. You have military in those countries, whatever. Why can't we put a few hundred people into Venezuela? And of course, they kind of have a point, but they don't really, in the sense that we have acknowledged sort of that Latin America, there's been acknowledgement, is the U.S. backyard. So that's fine. But the Russians point out, so are the Baltics our backyard. And don't lecture us about going to, we'll get out of Venezuela, but if you send the military and NATO, if we take a chunk of whatever, Estonia, Finland, or Latvia, or whatever, don't lecture us. So this is both very dangerous and very complex, and I have absolutely no idea how this is going to resolve itself. What we're going to learn is that whoever wins essentially has similar policy. Mr. Gantz's policy is not all that different than Netanyahu in the sort of the core of the policies. But what we, I think, learn long term is that the two-state solution is dead. And if the two-state solution is dead, whether the West Bank is annexed or not annexed, or when it's annexed, what you essentially will have is a state of Israel where the minority of people are Jewish. So if people care about Israel, and think that they're somehow attached to it being a Jewish state, which some people are and some people are not, but let's say you're attached to the idea of a Jewish state. The policies, no matter what they are right now, or what the outcome is, essentially has moved away from a two-state solution. The Palestinians no longer believe in it, the Israelis liberal no longer believe in it, the right wing no longer believes in it, and so the more Palestinians you incorporate, the lower and lower the proportion of Jewish people in Israel. Now, for some people, that's not a problem. That is to say, it's going to be a multi-religious, multi-ethnic state. But for those of you who are attached to the idea of a Jewish state, it is going away in front of your eyes. It is absolutely going away. Even if the West Bank were not annexed, it's going to go away if you don't have a two-state solution because of population growth. That is to say, you're not going to get more Jews coming from around the world into this mess, and people other than the settlers who have tons of children in hopes of repopulating Israel, the rest of the Israelis have no interest in that. And the Palestinians are having a birth rate that's somewhere between 2 and 3, so more than replacement. So sooner or later, it's going to be a multi-religious state. So when that happens, you can either roll over and say, okay, so we, the Jews of Israel, are a very major chunk. Historically, we're the most important part and so forth. But everybody who lives inside the state of Israel will be a citizen of the state of Israel and will be treated decently. No one believes that that's going to happen. I mean, sometimes almost everybody thinks Israel will become an apartheid state. And then, if Israel becomes an apartheid state, you give some rights and so forth to the Palestinians, but not really enough, and you don't really treat them identically and so forth. You've got a problem. And how that can stabilize, and under Trump, of course, he will strongly support whoever gets elected today, right? So they have America's support, but they're not going to have the rest of the world's support for a state in which you have, eventually a minority ruling a majority without it making a multi-religious, multi-ethnic state. So I don't know that there is a good outcome to this. I can't see it, given what's been talked about in the current election. I mean, it is true that Mr. Gantz will be more reasonable in many ways, and he doesn't have to be as allied with the United States. It's also true, of course, that some future president could pull the rug out from under Israel, because the fact that Israel is doing so well, has the state of the technology arms, has, made all those, the Desert Bloom has done all of this, is essentially off the back of American money. Right? We have supported this for good historical reasons. And support of all of that is based on thinking about what happened to Jews in the Second World War and making compensation, and we're a rich state and we have a Jewish population, and so forth and so on. But can some future American president really support so much American money going into Israel? I don't even mean private money, which is also the case, but I mean public money. The largest amount of defense spending up until now has been Israel. The largest amount of this, the largest amount of that. So I think that there might be trouble down the line when somebody says, look, you can't be an apartheid state, you've got to be more democratic, otherwise we're going to pull back. But that's not happening in the next 2 years, right? So it's one of these things where no matter, I think, what the outcome is, it's going to be a mess. And it's going to be a worse mess or a lesser mess. And I know I'm always so negative. Ask me something about which I can become positive in the next 5 minutes. Yes. The younger generation of Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda are intermarrying and getting together and saying no more and so forth. You tried. What was it? 80% of the Tutsis in Rwanda got slaughtered. It is true that the government and the younger generation are trying to figure out some way to live peacefully with the remaining Tutsis and Hutus. It is also the case that Rwanda did good things in terms of having truth commissions, and every village had to, people had to say that they had committed crimes and what the crimes were and so forth, sort of cleansing. So in that sense, they did all the right things. And the government of Rwanda is a very effective and efficient government. It's made remarkable changes economically and in the general welfare of the country, and it doesn't allow any discrimination that's based on ethnic stuff and so forth. He's also a serious dictator, an authoritarian dictator who jails the opposition or kills them. He's also constantly getting reelected, and it's unclear how you're going to get a change of regime there. And those of us, who study that part of the world are saying, yeah, but it's hard to know what's going to happen down the road given the government is so authoritarian and is allowing very little opposition and discussion and so forth. So maybe the youth, when it comes into power, will have better ideas. When will they come into power? How much longer will he stay? The U.S. is supporting him in every imaginable way rather than urging elections right now. I'm not sanguine about it, but it's certainly these kiddies have taken it into their own hands and said, let's stop this nonsense. So in that sense, it's good news. But all right, one more question, and then I liberate you to cheerful outside. Forget that historically it's the older generation which votes in greater numbers. And rather than young folks, and they go out and they scream and whatnot for a particular candidate, but then the day of the election they find something better to do and don't actually go, so it depends on how many of them will turn out. The other thing I think is that, I know this sounds counter to what you imagine me saying, I really think that unless the presidential candidate is a male person, the chances are reduced, because we know from the last election that white men won't vote for women. White men will also not vote for a minority person. In both Obama election, as well as the population in general speaking voted for him, the proportion of white males who actually voted for Obama was very small. So it was women, it was young people, it was all kinds of people. So even though many of the people running are women, and one wants to have a woman become president, I think it's very dangerous business to not have I know this is controversial, not have a male candidate with a female candidate or candidate of color as vice presidential candidate that's announced in advance. I think that would maximally increase voting. But I could be totally wrong. Julia. She won the popular vote. Yeah, she won the popular vote, but we still have the electoral system, and it will be in play in the next election. Hillary Clinton did not win white male voters, and Obama did not win them. So if you look at it. So if you're trying to drag out as many voters voting for the next Democrat, but we're not going to get rid of the Electoral College nor the gerrymandering under the current administration, so you have imagined that could replicate itself. But we should be hopeful, and we should support candidates